Adwa. Mussolini versus Menelik II. Menelik of Ethiopia. And the newly created Kingdom of Italy was a newcomer to the division of Africa. And as the late conqueror, he had barely reached the last slice of the cake. Eritrea and Somalia, east of the continent in the so-called Golden Horn. On its western border was the Kingdom of Ethiopia, then under the rule of King Menelik II. Cautious, Menelik knew Italy was a dangerous enemy, and that if he erred in his action, he would see his kingdom fall to the invaders as it had happened on the rest of the continent. But Menelik was smart. In times when neighboring kingdoms were falling, he began to analyze the role of powerful European firearms and their ability to destroy any traditional army, and carried out a series of missions and purchases with a view to modernize his army. When it came time for battle, he planned to use his brand new rifles in order to avoid the fate of initially successful armies that later collapsed, such as that of the Zulu. For now, however, he was cautious. In 1889, he handed over the province of Bogos, Hamasen, Akele Guzai, and Serai to the Italians in exchange for the signing of a treaty in which their independence was guaranteed. Italy, however, expected more than that. Italy. The Italians had played a little trick in the treaty. In the Amharic Ethiopian language version, it clearly stated that the Ethiopian king could use the services of Italian diplomacy if required. However, the Italians had a version in which it was stated that any relationship must necessarily go through them. That is, in practice, they had turned Ethiopia into a protectorate without the right to make relations with other European powers. Of course, Menelik was not very happy about it. He was willing to negotiate with the Italians, but with the whole purpose of maintaining his independence. Ethiopia could not be the subject of a foreign power. And so, in the lands of the legendary Prester John, war trumpets sounded. The Italian March. Italy decided that she would subdue Ethiopia by force and sent General Orest Barateri, who subdued a series of rebellious populations and marched deep into Ethiopian territory. In 1895, a famine struck the region and both armies were affected. Barateri knew that Menelik was weakened, but he himself barely had provisions for 5 days and decided to organize a withdrawal. He thought, perhaps rightly, that they could wait near the coast for famine to ravage Menelik's troop to restart the mission the following year. They had the possibility to supply themselves by sea. But both his men and the Italian High Command, here they considered their withdrawal unacceptable and insisted on the destruction of Menelik's army, fearing that a year would give him time to better organize resistance. Thus, Baratieri ordered his soldiers to march on February 29 of that year to meet Menelik's troops. The Ethiopians outnumbered them 5 or 6 to 1. Baratieri had almost 18,000 soldiers. Menelik had between 80 and 100,000. The exact number is not clear. But the Italians were not worried about that, as many wars had been fought that way in Africa. They had invariably ended with the victory of the Europeans. They thought they would simply repeat history one more time. But Menelik was prepared. He divided his army into several sections and saved his elite troops, the Shewa, for the definitive counterattack. In total, it had about 60 to 70,000 men armed with rifles, of which 25,000 made up its Shewa, and almost 20,000 armed with spears. Likewise, it had more than 10,000 mounted men. The battle was about to begin. Preparations. We ended the previous episode with the march of the Italian commander, Orest Baratieri, who had launched his army of almost 20,000 men through the mountains of Ethiopia to defeat Emperor Menelik II, the last autonomous ruler of the African continent. The situation was critical for both armies. Ethiopia was experiencing a drought and food was hard to come by, and Menelik knew he didn't have much time. But the Italian situation was not better, and at the time of the conflict they barely had food for 4 more days. As we mentioned in the previous article, Baratieri was convinced that a withdrawal was best, but his second in command assured him that this would not be accepted by the Italian High Command. The general also knew that he would soon be replaced, so he was interested in having the honor of being the first to provide Italy with a colony in Africa. His urgency would be his undoing. Menelik II, for his part, needed a dramatic defeat from the Italians in order to put an end to his colonial pretensions, and he knew he was short on time. However, he knew the terrain and was careful. His plans were to lure the Italians onto unfavorable terrain and force a fight. Fortunately for the emperor, this would not be unnecessary. Italian irresponsibility would put them right where he wanted them. The battle. The Italians' maps were old and not very accurate, and their troops were not as well equipped. They had new rifles, but they used older versions in order to finish the Carthage and not lose them. On the night of February 29, 1895, the Italian troops divided into 3 columns and began the march, but ended up moving several kilometers away from each other because the maps were less accurate than expected. This would prove fatal. Matteo Alberton's column turned at some point in the night to rejoin the rest of the army and unknowingly began to approach the position of Ras Alula, one of the commanders of the Ethiopian army. Alula immediately sent emissaries to the emperor to inform him that the Italians had left. The surprise effect had been broken, and the Ethiopians had time to place their guns and men in the high areas surrounding the pass to which Alberton was heading. There, they didn't have to do more than wait for the unsuspecting Italian troops. At 6 in the morning, the battle began. Alberton soon saw his position ravaged by Ethiopian fire, including several cannons that appeared to have been donated by the Russians, who always had sympathy for the African emperor. As a side note, there are indications that volunteer Russian troops marched alongside the Ethiopians, but this has never been proven. His troops, Askaris from Eritrea, were at a great numerical disadvantage, and despite their courage and efficiency, they soon began to lose ground. The army disbanded when its commander, Alberton, was taken prisoner by the Ethiopians, but by then the survivors were able to meet the troops of Giuseppe Arimondi, who had just arrived to support Alberton's column. A sudden charge pushed the Ethiopians back. It seemed that Italy still had a chance to win. The illusion didn't last long. Arimondi was in a better position than Alberton. He had more men and better knowledge of the terrain, but he was still outnumbered. He was able to withstand the charge of Menelik's less trained troops with some ease. But Menelik saw the opportunity and threw his Shewas at Arimondi's position, forcing him to retreat quickly. The last Italian column, led by Vittorio Dobormida, was never able to help his companions. In marching to the aid of Alberton, he encountered strong Ethiopian positions and had to begin a slow retreat in march of a more defensible position. In doing so, however, he unknowingly ended up in a narrow valley where his troops were wiped out. The consequences. The battle ended in less than 6 hours with a decisive Ethiopian victory. In all, Italy lost nearly 11,000 men, counting just under 6,500 dead, 1,500 wounded, and 3,000 prisoners. Menelik II made the wise decision to avoid a campaign to expel the Italians from Eritrea and Somalia, but instead used his advantage to force the agreement according to Ethiopian perceptions, and by doing so, he avoided a subsequent Italian campaign that could have been victorious. In Italy, Adwa's defeat precipitated an unprecedented crisis. In Ethiopia, it served to remind Africans that they could defend themselves, and in Europe, to remind you that the continent was not completely subdued yet.